When we think about miracles in the Bible, we usually think about the miracles of Jesus. We think about how Jesus raised the dead, how he fed the 5,000 with leftovers, and just so many things that Jesus did. He healed the lepers and helped people to walk again. But do we think about the miracles in the Old Testament? Because there were quite a few. Just reading in 2 Kings chapter 4 about Elisha, we find several miracles that were enacted through Elisha. Now we start out with a widow woman who has two sons that are being sold, taken into slavery to pay her debts. And she goes to the man of God and she says, this isn't, what are we going to do here? And he says, well, what do you have in your house? Well, all I have is a little bottle of oil. And he says, well, I tell you what, you go to your neighbors and you gather a whole bunch of vessels. Don't get just a few. And you bring them in your house. And after you bring them in your house, then you pour oil from your jar into all those vessels. And then you sell the oil. And whatever's left over after you pay your debts, you live on that. That's what she did. I mean, she kept pouring out the oil until ran out of vessels. Sold the oil, paid her debts, kept her sons, lived on the leftovers. Well, later on, we have Elisha traveling, and there's a Shunammite woman. Now, this Shunammite woman was married to an old man, and apparently the Shunammite woman was still fairly young, and Elisha asked his servant, what can we do for the Shunammite woman? And the servant says, well, she doesn't have any kids. So Elisha calls the Shunammite woman. He says, this time next year, you're going to have a son. And she's like, oh, don't kid with me. Don't kid with me. And sure enough, that time next year, the Shunammite woman had a son. So there's a miracle right there because her husband was old. Well, the kid grows for a while and he goes out to the field where his father is, and he says, oh, my head, my head. And he's carried back to his mother, the Shunammite woman, and he dies. She takes him up, lays him on the prophet's bed, and she goes to find Elisha. And Elisha's like, what's going on? And she says, all is well, but I'm not leaving you. So he sends Gehazi ahead with his staff and tells him to lay the staff on the child's face, which Gehazi does, but there's no change. So Elisha gets to her house and he goes into his room where the child is laid and he prays and he lays himself on the boy. And the boy gets warm, but he doesn't stir. So he goes down and he walks the floor a little bit and he prays some more and he goes back up and he lays himself on the child again. And the child sneezes a few times and he comes back to life. So there we have raising the dead right there in the Old Testament. Isn't that pretty cool? But that's not the last miracle because there comes a famine in the land. And Elisha says, well, let's make a pot of stew for the sons of the prophets. So they make a pot of stew and they go and gather wild herbs and stuff. Well, they don't know what they're getting. They don't know what this stuff is, but they put it in the pot because they figure, maybe it's edible. Well, then they start to eat it and they start to get sick. And they said, there's poison in the pot. So what does Elisha do? He says, well, bring me a little bit of meal. So he takes the meal and he puts it in the pot. And the poison is gone. Now, I don't think you can, in the natural, put a little bit of meal in a pot and the poison go away. So there's a miracle there. But again, we've got this famine going on. But eventually somebody brings some food to Elisha, 20 barley loaves, a little bit of grain. And Elisha says, well, let's feed this to the sons of the prophets. And they say, this little bit? You got 100 men to feed. This isn't going to be enough. And Elisha says, yeah, just go ahead and feed it to them. So they do. There's 20 loaves of bread. And I'm pretty sure there weren't huge loaves because one person brought them. 20 little barley loaves and some grain. They feed 100 men. And there's leftovers. So you see, in one chapter of the Bible, in the Old Testament, we have all these miracles. God cared about his people then. He cared about his people when Jesus was on the earth. And he still cares about his people. And you know what? He's still doing miracles. And if you need a miracle, well, have you asked? Stood in faith? Don't give up. Talked about not giving up the other day. But don't give up on your faith. If you've asked God for something, if you're believing God for a miracle, don't give up. Just keep standing. God, your word says whatever it is you're believing for. And don't give up. Because God still does miracles.